From the Daily Catch, this is The Catch Up, and I'm Walter Mullin. In towns like Rhinebeck and Red Hook, something unexpected is happening inside Catholic churches. After decades of decline, church pews are filling again, especially with younger people. Some are returning after years away, others are joining for the first time. And while the reasons may vary, many point to the same things: a search for structure, a need for community, and a desire for something steady in a fast-changing world. Behind the numbers are deeply personal stories. A mother rediscovering faith through a simple lesson about patience, a father navigating unimaginable loss, a man searching for peace after years of anger and disconnection. Together, their experiences raise a bigger question. Is this a lasting return to faith or just a moment in time? I'm joined by reporter Athan Janos, who will tell us more about this trend that is taking place not only here in our community, but across the country. It's the week of April 20th. Athan, welcome back to the studio.
Walter, thank you so much for having me. And that was a beautiful introduction. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's start at the beginning. What first drew you to this story? What made you think there's something going on here?
Yeah. So would you like the long story or the short story?
How about the mid-range story?
Mid-range story. Okay. So I first got acquainted with this Catholic church through a story about a new homeless shelter in Red Hook that ultimately didn't come to fruition. But as I was talking to the pastor there, he said to me, I don't have a story on this yet, but I have a really great story about an Our Lady of Guadalupe event happening at our church, where we're going to have a ton of members of the Mexican community here, and we're going to have a big celebration. And so I did a video project on that event, and I was shocked at how many people were there and just how packed the church was and how large the event was. And so that was kind of my first bell of like, okay, there's something going on in this church that I'm not really seeing in the other churches. And then in late December, I came across a Facebook post from the church telling people not to park at the adjacent Episcopal church's parking lots because they have so many people at the church and not enough parking spots. So they're like, don't park at the adjacent church's parking lot. That's not allowed. You have to park further down the road. And so that was the signal to me, like, hey, there's something going on at this church. There's a story here. Let me try to get underneath the numbers and also try to understand the numbers even more.
That's interesting. So the overflow from the Catholic parking lot into the Episcopalian parking lot was your trigger that something's happening. That's fascinating. So speaking of people, Athan, you open the story with Joseph Boland as he's preparing for military training and getting confirmed. Why did you choose Joseph as your entry point for the story?
Yeah, so as you mentioned in the introduction, there was a lot of different stories and captivating stories that I could have led with. But ultimately with Joseph, I just felt the timing was too perfect, with him leaving literally the next day after he got confirmed in the church to start his training to become a combat pilot. And during the confirmation service, Father Maurer, who's the main pastor there, had this great line that said, even though Joe's going to be serving our country, more importantly, he's going to be serving our kingdom. And this solicited a standing ovation from the crowd. And so I just thought that he would really, that story would be really impactful to the community. And of course, whether or not you agree with the concept of war or whether it should ever happen, I do believe that the people who sign up to risk their lives to protect us are incredibly brave. And so it was an opportunity to highlight something in the community and in our country more broadly that I thought was worth highlighting without having to stray too far away from the main point of the story. And not that it's worth much, but I was able to attend his confirmation and get a really good photo of him. So I thought that would lead to peace and be nice.
So let's talk a little bit more, Athan, about the people who really are driving this trend. You mentioned Joseph Boland. Are the other people, well, who are they? Are they younger? Are they older? What can you tell us about them?
Yeah, so I think from what I've read and gathered in reporting, the consensus nationally seems to be that the trend is driven by young Gen Z people in that 18 to 25 age group. and that's particularly by young men. However, in Red Hook and Rhinebeck, what I found is that the demographic is a little bit older, with the majority being in that kind of older Gen Z age bracket and the millennial age group as well. And we can also say that for St. Christopher's Church and Good Shepherd, which is the joint parish between the two, a lot of the parishioners driving the trend are people who grew up Catholic or culturally Catholic, but fell out of the church when they got older, when they went off to college, when they became independent, and are now returning to the church for the first time in 15, 20, 25 years. And Father Maurer, the priest there, had this great line that I think it's important to restate. The people who left are not the people returning. And that really underscores the point about who's filling the pews and who's driving this trend, at least in Red Hook and Rhinebeck specifically.
Interesting. So if we can talk about everyone who's returning, if we can look for sort of a broad theme, the theme seems to be people searching for structure and stability. Did that surprise you, especially among younger people?
Well, first off, that's such a loaded question, and that's very hard to answer, particularly because I am in that age group. I am part of that demographic. And so I have to try at least a little bit to separate my own personal answer to that question from my reporting. And the short answer is no, I'm not particularly surprised. I think one could argue that nationally, the last 5 or 6 years dating back to COVID have been volatile. And anytime that happens, people are looking for an anchor or a rock to steady the ship, so to speak. And the Catholic Church is one institution that has been, for better or worse, unchanging in terms of its practices, its traditions, its belief, and it's also universal. So the church in Red Hook, the things that people are reading in the church of Red Hook, the things that people are doing on a Sunday in the church in Red Hook, people are also doing the exact same thing in Sao Paulo, Brazil, or in Milan, Italy, or in Warsaw, Poland. And I think that stability and that connection, people worldwide, is really valuable in times of, as I said, volatility.
You mentioned this being sort of a consequence of coming out of the COVID pandemic. And I think that's very interesting and very incisive on your part. But a lot of these stories are deeply personal as well. They're about loss, they're about grief, they're about major life transitions. How central are these very personal moments in driving people back to their faith?
Yeah, I think personal loss, personal grief, and major life transitions are all periods in one's life that are fragile. And to combat that fragility, people look for stability. When you lose somebody that you care about and that you love, and you're trying to make sense of that, or grieving over a lost one, or you're having major change in your life that you're trying to understand, generally when quote unquote normal things or everyday things don't help you, you're going to turn to, things that are steady and things that have been there forever. And you're going to put your uh, life into the hands of something that has not changed and has not moved and has not wavered. And I think you mentioned personal stories and the loss and the grief. And I think the people that I interviewed, when they lost someone they really cared about, when things in their life changed majorly, they sought the church to provide them with not only an answer to those problems, but also to find hope that, they can get through this period because they have this stable rock, so to speak, now in their life that they're putting their time into.
That makes sense. As part of your reporting, Athen, you spoke to Michael Pipard, who's a professor of theology at Fordham University, and he identified 6 reasons why people are returning to the Catholic Church. I just want to read these 6 reasons right now and ask you to comment on them. So again, these are the 6 reasons why Michael Pipard, professor of theology at Fordham, believes people are returning. Number 1, a desire for community. Number 2, a search for stability. Number three, the rise of online Catholicism. Number four, a return to traditionalism. Number five, a rebellion against what he described as the previous generation's anti-religiosity. And finally, number six, a move by some to align more closely with what they see as the Catholic Church's progressive stance on immigration. So that's a lot, but which of these might be the most important based on your reporting?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but and one thing I'll say is my sample size compared to the number of people joining nationally was relatively small. But among the people that I spoke to, community and stability were the two most prominent factors. But there's also something that's worth repeating that you mentioned in the introduction, which is that for these 7 congregates, the decision to join the church or to come back to the church was very personal and was influenced by deeply specific events in their own life that can't really be applied to other people's life or to a trend, so to speak. So to say that each of the 7 congregants were influenced by the structural factors that Michael Pepard listed would definitely be correct to some degree. But I think if you really want to understand why individual people have joined a church, you also have to try to understand their life stories to some extent.
You're exactly right. So in addition to the 6 reasons that Michael Pepard outlined, I'm going to add a 7th reason, Pope Leo. I've heard many people say the new Pope has given them a renewed interest in the Catholic Church. He's certainly in the press and in the media right now based on his sparring with President Trump. Did Pope Leo come up at all in your reporting?
It did not. I think it hasn't even been a year since Pope Leo was elected to be the Pope and I guess initiated as the Pope. And so I think the verdict is definitely still out. But I do think you're right that especially in recent months, Pope Leo has renewed a lot of people's interest, and he's definitely generated a lot of media attention, partly thanks to our president in recent months. And so I think that's going to be something to pay attention to as we follow this story into the next year and in years following. What I can tell you is in speaking to people, not just for this story, but just, gathering information and being in those communities, I spoke to someone who's not in this story, but who said that the Catholic priests love Leo. They love Leo. They find him so refreshing. They find him to be somebody who's incredibly deliberative, somebody who thinks a lot before he speaks, somebody who sticks to doctrine. And when he comments on political events or things happening in the world, he does so in such a way where he's saying something political, but without actually saying something political. And the way that he phrases it are very diplomatic. Now, that personally surprised me a little bit because what you had mentioned about him sparring with President Trump, and it seems like he's been very adamant about his stance on the US's war with Iran right now. But it's worth noting that I think, at least right now, the Greece seem to really appreciate Leo for what it's worth.
Well, I think the world is going to keep its eyes on Pope Leo in the short term. So we can't talk about the Catholic Church, Athen, without talking about the clergy sex abuse crisis in the late 1990s and early 2000s. That crisis actually drove a lot of people away from the Catholic Church. Have people forgotten about that now? How does that reality, and by reality, I mean the reality of the clergy sex abuse crisis, how does that reality align with this trend of increased participation in the church right now?
Yeah, so Dr. Pepard, as you pointed out, said that the clergy abuse crisis was, quote, a tectonic, complete shift in American Catholicism. And my generation, the Gen Z generation, didn't grow up with the scandal in the same way that our parents and our grandparents' generation did. Pepard said that at Fordham, he now has to teach students about and explain how big of a deal just this clergy sex abuse crisis was in the Catholic Church and how it impacted people leaving the church after that scandal was uncovered. And it was furthermore uncovered that the Catholic Church was covering up those clergy abuses. Now, I don't know that we can say that the sex abuse crisis has factored in to now why people are joining the church, but it may have played a role in cases where people that would have in the past not joined the church when they otherwise would have because of the clergy sex abuse crisis, now because you're seeing a generation that didn't grow up with that, they don't have the background of the sex abuse crisis to necessarily prevent them or dissuade them from joining the church as people would have in the past.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to drill down on something that we've touched on now many times in this podcast, the idea of community. It comes up over and over again. What does that actually look like in these parishes? What are people finding there that they're not finding elsewhere? And let's try to be as specific as we can. Does it mean they're staying behind after Mass and having coffee and donuts? Or does it mean they're getting together outside of the church and playing pickleball? I mean, what does it really mean to have found a community by going back to the Catholic Church?
The first time that I went to one of the services, I made the mistake of getting there 5 minutes late because I figured I would talk to people after the service and interview people. And Walter, I could not find a parking spot like 3 streets down. I had to park all the way back at the school, the St. Christopher's School, all the way at Benner Road, which is like about a 10-minute walk from the church. You walk into the church and you have the pews are packed. You have people standing because they can't have seats. It really is something that I was shocked to see. And you know, I've been to a lot of the other churches in Red Hook for another story that I did, and I've been to town events, and I've been to village events, and to see this many people in one space in such a in a village of 2,000 people was quite extraordinary, quite extraordinary. Now, to your larger question, what does that actually look like in terms of being there? Well, the first point is the community is incredibly diverse. You see people who are Hispanic. You see people whose first language isn't English, who maybe don't speak English. You see people who are senior citizens. You see families. You see young children. You see infants. And that feeling of seeing all these people in a diverse group of people in one space, you can find somebody that looks like you and find somebody that you relate to in a very positive way. And I think that matters to people. And that from the people that I've spoke to, that matters. The other thing I'll say is the church is not just the church. So they offer programs that people in the church participate in, particularly for the youth. So they have the CYO basketball program, which I did a story on, and that takes place in the winter months and has a really, really strong community of people. Then they have a CCD program, which stands for the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, which is essentially a youth Catholic education program. And a lot of the people from about 3rd grade to 8th grade come to that program. They meet their friends. Their teachers at Red Hook schools are also the educators in that program. The parents come and they pick up their students and they meet other parents. And so they just develop a sense of community by participating in these programs and by coming to church that it's harder and harder to do for a variety of reasons. And we'll touch on technology, I believe, in future questions. But the third part of this is that it's not just the number of people and the diversity of community inside the church, but it's also how widespread the church community is, from, as I mentioned, from people in the schools to people at local restaurants to farmers to firemen. In all aspects of Red Hook, you can find people in the church. And I'll give you an example recently that illustrates this. there was a fire that we heard about in Mullin. Turns out it was just a microwave fire, but it was a family of 7 and they were all hospitalized. And we were trying to run down the story and find anything about the people that were hospitalized and hurt. And it just so happened that around that time I was texting with the priest at the time because it was right before the story came out. And I was supposed to meet him. And I said, "Oh, shoot, I'm not going to be able to meet you because I have to go and run down this fire." And he said, "Oh, funny. I just visited that family in the hospital. I'm the only people that has seen them since the fire because they're some of my parishioners. They're all okay. 2 are on oxygen, but they're all naked and they're all okay." And so it was just like this coincidence where he was this random fire that was happening in Milan and a story that we were going to track down completely unrelated to the church. And yet it tied back to St. Christopher's and the community and how widespread the community is in the church.
Yeah, that's a really great example, Appen. That's a great example. So let's talk for a moment, Appen, about this notion of online Catholicism and technology. You talk about this in your reporting, social media and online religious content. How big of a factor is this notion of online Catholicism and technology in this trend of people coming back to the church?
Yeah, so I actually think there's 2 forces at play here. One is like the negative aspect of it, and another is the positive aspect of it. And on the negative side, right, we see people who have grown up largely in a social media era, and particularly after COVID, I'll keep coming back to it, when we were locked down and people were yearning for real human connection. I think people haven't necessarily fully recovered from that. And the church is a place where they can put the phone down and find an interaction that's real and human. That was the case with Daniel DiDio, who he mentioned that he just wanted to throw the phone away and be in a place where he could connect to things around him. And Catholicism is in some sense a very physical and an active religion in the sense that it's not just enough to sit in the back of the pews for 40 minutes and then you leave, right? You have to participate actively in the sacraments. You have to do things when you walk into the church with your hands. You have to interact with the other people in the pews. And so it's a collective tradition and an active community that I think people really value. Now, on the positive side, no doubt we're seeing more and more religious content appear on social media and the internet. And that takes the form of like influencers and apps and even just celebrities speaking more openly about religion, I would say. And I think part of that rise and its popularity is driven and reinforced by the same factors we've been speaking about, right? I don't think that the religious and Catholic content would be as widespread if there wasn't already a real demand for it among the youth population. But I do think that when people are, as we said, lost or they're searching for something and scrolling through social media, and then you see somebody and they're like giving a testimony about how coming back to Catholicism changed their lives, or you see a social media influencer and they're posting photos of their church and how packed it is and how strong the community is, and they're talking about how they have all their friends there. Like that really does matter and impact people. And so I think it just maybe reaches people who weren't necessarily reached by Catholic messaging in the past. But I don't know that it would have existed as widespread as it was if there wasn't already this demand that we're seeing because of the other factors that we touched upon.
It's interesting that you talked about wanting to throw your phone away. I have those feelings multiple times a day. So I'm right there with you. Athen, there's an interesting tension in the story. So many people are showing up and they're going back to church, but the question remains whether they'll stay. So do you have any comments or insights on how church leaders are thinking about this?
I do. I do. And I can say that from speaking to Father Maurer, he said, he had this great quote: trends are not just about intake, they're about retention. And it's great to see new faces in the church. It's from their perspective, it's great to see people coming in because of a quote unquote trend, but they don't want it to stay a trend, right? The challenge will be for them to engage those newcomers in such a way where they don't rise and fall with the tide, right? When the conditions change, when the trend becomes less trendy, are those new faces going to continue to stay? And the verdict is still out. The verdict is still out. But definitely, at least from the pastor at St. Christopher's and Good Shepherd, he wants to pump the brakes a little bit on people claiming that Catholicism is back. Because he would say it never left, but he would also say that, like, we want to make sure that we keep the people that we're taking in.
It makes sense. So, Athan, something you said earlier in the taping has really stuck with me. You talked about the parking lot at the Catholic Church being full on Sunday and the parking lot across the street at the Episcopalian Church not being as full. And in my mind, that's a microcosm, obviously, that the Catholic Church is having this big trend in seeing more parishioners. But why? Why are other churches and other religions not seeing the same uptick, or are they?
That's a very difficult question to answer, and I don't want to come across like I'm saying that one does something better in a way that others do, or that you know, like when the people that I spoke to who changed religions and converted to Catholicism, who weren't raised Catholic, they wanted to very much emphasize that it wasn't them like dissing the other religions or them saying anything negative about that. And I want to continue on that same line of thinking. But what I will say is, speaking to Peppard, he said that the Catholic churches that tend to thrive feature priests who are both welcoming and compassionate, while also being morally and ritually demanding. And I think that also applies to other churches, not just Catholic churches. And I can say that some of the other denominations, from what other people have said to me, are very good at being welcoming and compassionate. And they're very good about being open and allowing everybody to come in, which is great. But the challenge they have is also being demanding. And I think one of the benefits of the Catholic Church is that there is no bending the rules, right? This is what you have to do, and we'll welcome you and open you and helping you get to that point. But so far as whether or not you still have to do those things, that's firm and that's steady. And I think people are looking for that strong guidance and that strong hand, for lack of a better term, to guide them and to force them to really engage in the rituals and in the sacraments and in the church. I will say too, we don't have an Orthodox church in Rhinebeck or Red Hook, or in Clinton for that matter. So I didn't incorporate that. I didn't visit that church, and I didn't visit an Orthodox church or incorporate that into the story. But we have seen that this trend of young people joining the Catholic Church has also been the case among the Orthodox churches in America. And part of why I bring that up is because the Orthodox Church also has that same rigidness, that same steady demand for what you have to do and kind of unbending rules for the church. And perhaps that is also why it is seeing some success. Now, obviously, churches like the Episcopal Church, churches like the Baptist Church, churches like the Presbyterian Church, you're going to get different things depending on which part of the country you're in, right? If you're in the South, then maybe the Protestant Church is even more strict and more rigid than the Catholic Church. If you're in New York and in Vermont and in the Northeast, it's probably going to be a lot less rigid and a lot less demanding. And so it's a tough question to answer, but I think that's the best answer I'm able to give right now.
That's fascinating, Nathan. I think your perspective is interesting. So if I can play back what you're saying, the rigidity and the unbending nature of the Catholic Church, which many people criticized in the past, now may be a benefit. And it's providing the structure that people are looking for. It's very interesting.
I'll say like one of the people that I spoke to, Lisa Bear, she said to me like I felt like I needed something to restore those traditions and that sense of morality that I had grown up with. And the Catholic Church gave me that. Now she grew up in North Carolina. And so since moving to New York, she felt like that was a little bit eroded, especially in recent years. And so you can kind of see that happen in people's lives.
Great. So, Athan, one final question for you before we wrap up for today. So, after all your reporting, what stayed with you the most on a personal level? You were out there, you were in the churches, you were at the services, you were talking to parishioners. Was there a moment or was there a story that you heard that really stuck with you?
To me, I compared this reporting to method acting almost, right? I didn't think it was enough to just attend one service and get good quotes from the parishioners. I really wanted to immerse myself in the environment, the atmosphere, and the culture. I told the priest jokingly several weeks ago, I said, I'll become Catholic for 6 weeks if I have to for this story. And so all that to say, I think two things really struck with me. One was just how personal, and I know we keep saying this, but how personal each of the 7 stories was. When I went into this, I was looking for structural factors. I was looking for something that I could, relate to a bigger picture and for something that they could give me. Like I wanted them to say, oh, it was J.D. Vance. Oh, it was Pope Leo. Oh, it was COVID. And in actuality, all of them ended up like recounting these deeply interesting, often tragic, also remarkable and inspirational stories about their own personal life. And through that, I not only got to learn more deeply about people inside the church, but I also got to learn more deeply about the people in our community, in Red Hook, in Rhinebeck, and the remarkable stories that they carry with them. And that is just so valuable. And, the first time I went to the church, I was a little bit intimidated. You see all these people lined up. I have the camera with me. I have the badge. Like, they're probably like, what is this guy doing inside my church? This is my sacred time. But being able to talk to parishioners outside of that environment. And I went to the diner with some of them and, got a cup of coffee and we chatted for a long time. And I really got to understand them. That to me was really beautiful. It takes something that when you walk in and you just see masses of people and it's hard to kind of understand what's behind that, to bring that out and get these touching stories was just, that's why, people do journalism. The second thing is, as I've talked about this, just how widespread the church is. Like, and the anecdote about the fire in Mullin really encapsulates it. But it was the head chef in Charlie O's. It's the owners in Charlie O's, by the way, are members. It's the firemen. It's the people that I see at town hall meetings. It's the people that I see in village hall meetings. It's the people that I see just driving through. It's the people that I see commenting on Facebook, on the Daily Catch post. Like it's wonderful to see that so many aspects of the community come and gather at this church.
That's fantastic. Well, Ethan, I thought your reporting was outstanding, and I know many of our readers did as well. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
This concludes today's episode of The Catch-Up. A big thank you to Matty Rosenberg, Jen Hammoud, and Esther Martell at our partner Radio Free Rhinecilff for their help in producing this episode. We'll see you next time.